Don't miss out. Get your free copy of Dr. Guido Holzman's How Inflation Destroys Civilization. Visit Mises.org/Rothpod free to get the book.
Hey guys, this is Tho Bishop from Radio Rothbard, and I want to let you guys know that we have reopened our April 13th event with the great Dr. Ron Paul in Lake Jackson, Texas. Our topic is Censorship and Official Lies, the End of Truth in America. As we know, the state is tightening its stranglehold on its own narrative as its web of lies unravels. The government's lapdogs and the news media continue to bark and howl on TV, even though a majority of American households have cut the cord. And of course, nothing resembling the truth can be heard in the softball press conferences at the White House and the Federal Reserve. To address this topic, we've got a great lineup featuring my co-host, Ryan McMaken, Daniel McAdams, and Mises President Tom DeLorenzo, and of course, the aforementioned great Dr. Ron Paul. If you want to attend this special event, we have new availability out there, $80 to attend. You can learn more about this at Mises.org/events, and we hope to see you there.
Welcome back to Radio Rothbard. I'm Ryan McMaken, Executive Editor at the Mises Institute, and with me, of course, is my co-host, Tho Bishop. And we're joined here today by Karl-Friedrich Israel. And Karl's been with the Mises Institute as an associate in various capacities for a number of years. He's been here a research fellow in the summertime, produced a number of papers for us, academic papers, also as a op-ed writer for Mises Wire, quite a few articles there as well. And really, I think of him in many ways as somewhat one of our guys in Europe, because if you follow our site, you know we have some very good commentators from Europe. Torsten Polite, we got Daniel Lacaille, and we've got Karl-Friedrich Israel as one of those as well. And so on this episode, I want to talk a little bit about Europe. If you've been following the American economic news, you know that inflation in February, the most recent data, ticked up again, started accelerating in the month-to-month data, that the employment data is starting to weaken after, 15 months of falling money supply in both M2 and in the Rothbard-Salerno money supply measure. And so it's a pretty unstable economy. There's a lot going on, and it's really all just part of what's been going on in terms of monetary policy really since about 2008. Has really accelerated the trend, lots more monetary production, and then things just went completely bonkers after 2020. And when we saw that money supply just really went off the rails with the United States, with our central bank creating anywhere from 4 to 6 trillion new dollars, which is really a huge percentage of the total money supply. And so lots going on with inflation there, both price inflation and monetary inflation. And it's really been interesting to watch how that's affected the economy overall. Now, this is all United States-centric. But it's always helpful and instructive, I think, to compare the United States to other regions as well. And we do look a bit at Latin America especially, and a bit at Asia. But I think one of the most interesting cases, of course, is Europe, the EU, the European Central Bank. And so we're going to talk a little bit with Karl Israel about that today. And so really, I just want to start off with just a real general sense of what's going on in the European economy right now. Not a lot of real specific details, but when here in the United States, we're thinking of the economy as, in spite of the administration saying it's really, really strong, there is a general feeling of weakness here in the United States, especially as we start to see layoffs mount, and there's also a cost of living situation where people are feeling that their wages are not keeping up with inflation. So just to give people a general picture, what's the general feeling about the economies of Europe right now in terms of growth and inflation and employment?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, Ryan and Tho. Glad to be here, glad to be back at the Mises Institute. I feel like we more or less have the same problems in Europe than you just described for the US. So very obviously people feel that their wages do not catch up with inflation, not even with the official inflation numbers. But I mean, if you look at alternative measures, if you look at a bit outside of the usual basket of goods that is included in the consumer price index, if you look at housing, if you look at other types of assets, clearly wages do not catch up with those prices at all. I mean, housing was bad for many years in Europe. We had, prior to the economic crisis, we had housing price bubble in the southern European countries, in France where I live, in Spain and Portugal, Italy. We didn't have it in Germany, where I'm originally from. But ever since the crisis, we have a massive house price bubble in Germany too. And prices in the southern European countries have not really corrected. They stagnated for a while. In countries like Spain, where it was really bad, they went down a bit, it's true. But in France, for example, they just stopped increasing for some time, and since 2012 they are increasing quite quickly again, continue to increase. And with a normal median or average wage in France, it's very hard now to buy a house to provide for a family. It's basically has become impossible. Certainly in the big cities like Paris and Lyon, but even in the smaller cities, in Angers, where I live, it's the housing market is really bad. As far as economic growth is concerned, this has been bad in Europe for many years now. If you look at the official numbers, real economic growth in terms of GDP was really low in Germany, for example. People think that Germany is a strong economy. It is compared to other European countries still a strong economy, but it hasn't been growing very quickly over the past years. Average growth has been 1.3% real growth, which is really low. And monetary expansion has been very comparable to the US. So during the COVID crisis between 2020 and 2022, the M1 money stock has increased by 2 trillion, roughly 25% in 2 years. It's quite a lot. And if you take a longer-term perspective, since the introduction of the euro, the M1 money supply has increased by a factor more than 6 in 25 years, which is massive. It's an average growth rate of 8% per year. And that's quite something. You wonder where the money goes. Certainly doesn't end up in the pockets of the average Joe.
Well, and I mean, this is something you've spent a lot of time looking at. Now, presently, I probably should have mentioned you're a professor of economics in the Department of Economics and Business at Western Catholic University in Angers, France. And so I know that inflation, how it's measured, how it's affected the economy, has been a topic of research for you. And so let's just look, now that we've established, I think, just the basic picture here. Also here in the United States, a matter of debate has been how are we measuring price inflation? Now, you've been talking about monetary inflation, which, of course, is something we have to always make a distinction of, right? There's money supply inflation, which is, of course, as if you read Mises, you know is what we really mean by inflation when we use the term inflation. But for lack of a better term, we also have to talk about price inflation.
And we always get emails if we don't clarify the term.
Yes, we all. Our readers are very astute about this.
Yeah, I know.
So, yes, we do understand the Misesian definition of inflation. So let's talk about price inflation, though, for a little bit and how it's measured. Now, of course, here in America, we have the Consumer Price Index, and there's been a lot of debate, over whether that's an accurate measure and whether there's a good way to read that, and is it underestimating inflation. So tell us, how is inflation measured in the EU and in the Eurozone, just so that our audience has a sense of if there's similar situation there as well?
It's very similar. I mean, the methods of calculating the index basically came from the US. Back in the 1990s, there was the so-called Bosket Commission that was working on the quality of the CPI and they identified biases, upward biases, sorry. They argued that the official CPI is estimating a too high an inflation rate. So we have to correct the methods of calculating it, most notably by introducing new forms of quality adjustments. So we don't use the raw prices we observe, but we correct for quality changes in the product. So if there's quality improvement, we reduce the observed price. We will end up with a lower inflation rate, of course. And we also changed the way or the frequency that the basket of goods is, the weights of the goods in the basket is changed. So usually you would fix a certain weighting scheme for a given period of time. In Europe, that used to be for 5 years. And you basically look at how the price of the basket, of the fixed basket, evolves over time. You don't change the basket. You don't change the weights. And this has been changed. Now every year the weights are adjusted. And sometimes, I mean, this is potentially a source for bias. There was a recent case in Germany. There was striking in 2023. In hindsight, the official weights were changed for 2022, which led to a reduction in the official price inflation rate of 1 percentage point. So the change in the weighting scheme was worth a percentage point in the official inflation number, which is astonishing. What did they change? Well, they reduced the weight for the sub-index that contains housing, water, electricity, gas, and other fuels. This used to be the biggest sub-index with the highest weight, because most of the average expenditure goes into these kinds of goods. It used to be about 25%. It has always been above 20%. And now, from one year to the other, they changed it down to 16.5%.
Wow.
Of course, this sub-index is the index where you had the highest inflation numbers. I think, especially for gas and other fuels, for obvious reasons, because of the war in Ukraine and the supply shortages, prices went up. We had inflation rates about 40% in that category. And they reduced, they basically cut the weight in half, which is implicitly assuming that the average household now spends half as big a share of overall expenditure on gas and other fuels and on housing and electricity and so on, which is not the case. The official rationale for this adjustment in the weighting scheme was that we now have better data sources and better methods. This was the official justification in the documents, which of course is ridiculous. It's not a justification at all. And if it is, then it means that the numbers before were no good. Yeah. So either way, it is a sign that there is a lot of wiggle room in constructing the official price inflation data, and everybody should know that you shouldn't put too much trust in these numbers.
Well, if anything, the data we get on this side of the ocean is that the amount of the percentage of one's income in Europe that has to go to energy, to heating one's home, has been significant and increased significant in recent years. So it seems odd that you would minimize the role of that in your basket.
In some other European countries, the weight for these for the sub-index has been very low for a longer time. In France, for example, it has been about 15% for a long time, which is completely ridiculous. It does not represent the reality that households live. The average household in France spends much more money on housing. I mean, it's not unusual that a third of your salary goes into housing just to pay the rent or pay for the credit that you took on to buy a house. So it has I would argue it had already been too low, and now they reduced it even further.
Yeah, and I know in the U.S., gaslighting the public seems to be the main goal of the Fed. I'm glad to see this is an international phenomenon with central bankers. It won't be too big of a shock for our listeners. But Karl, for the benefit of our listeners, from the American perspective, we have seen the Fed in recent years at least talk about the concerns about inflationary pressure. We've seen Powell talk a big game about his concerns about trying to get inflation back to the normal 2%, which we all know is a very scientific, optimal measure there. How's the ECB's approach been in terms of their public communication with the inflation pressures that real Europeans are feeling? And how's the public backlash been there? Because, again, I know here in the U.S., we get all sorts of articles about how great the economy is doing. This is an incredible economy. People aren't buying it. We're seeing this reflected, political polling and the like. How's the disconnect between, whatever the central bank is saying and what average people are saying? Obviously, if there's strikes going on and things like that, that itself is kind of a tell there. But how's kind of the communications aspect of monetary policy and its consequences in Europe right now?
Yeah. So first of all, the difference in the public perception and the official communication of the ECB is striking. There's interesting data in Europe, survey data on perceived price inflation, and it's done by the European Commission. And if you look at the median perceived inflation rate of households in Europe, it's about 4.5 percentage points, 5 percentage points above the official inflation number, which interestingly accounts exactly for the difference in price inflation, official price inflation, and monetary inflation. Yeah? So it's quite interesting that the perception of the households is much closer to what Mises would call inflation. Now, during the Corona or COVID pandemic, when prices initially fell, we had a mild price deflation, or let's say zero price inflation for a year, and then price inflation numbers started to increase quite sharply. And then the first thing, said by the officials in the European Central Bank, by Christine Lagarde and company, was to calm the public, saying that this was only transitory. This is only transitory. Don't worry, it's going to go down again very soon. And they quickly realized that this is ridiculous, and nobody buys this. Nobody was believing that this is true and that inflation numbers were going down. And for obvious reason, the expansion of the money stock was so massive. Why would you expect inflation to go down? So the communication changed. They stopped saying that it is a transitory phenomenon, and then they said, well, we will go back to 2%, but not as quickly as possible. This would hurt the economy, so we do it smoothly, nice and slow, 1 year to the other. We go down by one percentage point. Right? We have 8% now. Let's have 6 or 7 next year, and then we go gradually down. So inflation numbers now came down quite significantly, and more than I thought they would. Why? Well, because the ECB stopped increasing the money stock. If you look at the M1 data since 2022, since August, the M1 money stock is decreasing significantly. Well, they take out inflationary pressure and inflation numbers go down. This is what all classical economists, all monetarists, all Austrian economists have always said. If you want to stop price inflation, stop increasing the money stock.
Yeah, it's remarkable how that works, and a similar trend, of course, in the United States on a similar time frame. Although what we've noticed is we released some new American money supply data this week, and in recent months, year over year, the numbers are still way down, like Depression era sort of year over year declines. But in month over month changes, things have flattened out here in the United States, where they've let the interest rates sit at the same level for a while. And then yesterday, Wednesday, actually, this is we're talking about the most recent press conference from the Fed, which at the moment we're recording was 2 days ago. Powell said, "Oh well, we're gonna scale back our cuts to the balance sheet because, of course, they've got trillions that are sitting on their balance sheet now from assets they bought up, and they had been letting a lot of that roll off." And that, of course, has then deflationary effects. But he said, we're going to scale that back. We're not going to do as much of that, which is essentially the same as slightly lowering the interest rate. So they're already taking a dovish turn here, even though there's really not any solid evidence that the economy has really slowed down significantly in terms of its inflationary pressures. And I guess we're already at that point then with the central bank, because there's just constant pressure then to cut rates, to flood the economy again with easy money. The pressure comes from Washington and to fuel deficit spending, and from also Wall Street. Is there a similar phenomenon then in Europe where there's these parties who, outside even just the regime, who they depend on easy money? These are bubble industries. They want constant loosening. I assume there's some groups like this that have similar interests in Europe as well.
Yeah, absolutely. In France, in Angers, where I live, I can observe this in the housing market very clearly. So housing prices have stopped increasing. They started to decrease slowly, and you see the first real estate agencies closing their doors. It's fascinating how quickly this goes. This is a bubble industry as well. They depend on cheap money, low interest rates, and as long as the central banks pump in new money, business is good. But when they stop doing this, most of the businesses don't survive. So that's just an example, but I think the problem is broader. Low interest rate policies over an extended period of time, they just create dependencies in all sectors of the economy, especially in big corporations, the businesses that you would consider to be systemically relevant. And of course, they have a big lobby behind them, and they will sooner or later pressure monetary policy to go back to a more, to a looser stance, I would expect.
Now, we're talking about also real estate prices a bit, and in a number of the articles that Brendan Brown, one of our senior fellows, has published, starting several years ago, when many people were calling that this was, say, 2017, 2018, they say, the economy, it's going to collapse any day now, and they were all really ahead of the game. Brendan comes on, and he's got articles saying that no, we're not to that point in this cycle yet. We're still just on asset price inflation, and he was correct. At the time we still weren't seeing significant consumer price inflation ticking up. But through this whole period, really since 2008, since the last financial crisis, has been massive asset price inflation and stock prices and real estate prices. At least here in America and in the UK. Has there been a similar phenomenon then in Europe where you've seen a long-term period of asset price inflation? I mean, you've already mentioned that housing is expensive to begin with, but has there also been, in terms of the stock markets there and in terms of real estate and other asset prices, has there been a lot of inflation there that set in before consumer prices started to really inflate as well?
Well, asset price inflation certainly has accelerated in the last decade, since the financial crisis and the monetary policy responses to the financial crisis. But it has been there before. And this is well documented for basically all developed economies. The divergence between asset prices and consumer prices really started back in the 1980s already. So you have long-term evidence for overproportionate asset price inflation in the US and in Europe and in Japan and in the UK and so on. Since the introduction of the euro, we certainly had, so even before the financial crisis, we had asset price inflation, but in different forms, and there are different patterns in different countries. So house prices went up in the southern European countries since the introduction of the euro. If you look at France, from 1999, when the euro was introduced as an accounting currency, until the outbreak of the financial crisis in 2008, so that makes 9 years, average house prices have more than doubled in only 9 years. And until today, they have increased, they have not quite tripled, but almost. So it's quite astonishing how big asset price inflation in that sector has been. For Germany, asset price inflation has been elsewhere, mostly in the stock markets. So if you look at the DAX, you have overproportionate increases in the DAX since the introduction of the euro. We didn't have overproportionate house price inflation, but certainly in stocks we had it. And this has been accelerating since the unconventional monetary policies of the ECB.
Of course, when we talk about asset price inflation, winners and losers within that, there's a generational divide as well within that. Older generations benefit, younger generations are the ones that are not able to really benefit from that those prices going up. What's your sense on the economic anxieties of younger Europeans? You teach in France, from Germany. How economic anxiety, all sorts of viral TikTok videos here in the U.S. about concerns about buying a house, not having the same quality of life that their parents did. How's the generational divide being fueled by economic pressures in Europe from your experience?
Well, I think we have the same problem. And you raised an important point there. Of course, these asset prices are not included in the official inflation measure, and the official statistical bureaus have been reluctant to include them for several reasons. And the main reason is that asset price inflation is not bad for everyone. So if you own the assets and the prices increase, it's great for you. You have a positive wealth effect. Of course, it depends on the situation. Some people don't have the assets, but they try to buy some. They try to buy a house, start a family, and so on. And this clearly has become more difficult in Europe as well. And I think this is one driver of a lot of cultural and sociological developments in Europe as well as in the US. People starting families later, not marrying, not buying houses. And if they do go into debt and they take on ever larger credits and so on, they essentially become debt slaves, as some people would call it, which goes hand in hand with economic pressures, right? If you are highly indebted, you have to make sure to have a regular income, a high income to service your debt. You cannot allow yourself to take a break and, look for something else to do or take more time for the family. You have to work. And increasingly, 2 people have to work per household in order to make it work. A lot of the anxieties, I think, are very closely related to overproportionate asset price inflation. And this, I think, goes also into other areas like mental health. People have psychological problems and so on. They need more and more psychotherapy and so on. In France, it's astonishing how much medication people take for mental and psychological problems. This has been increasing. It's been an upward trend for quite a time now.
Yeah, I think we can wrap up the policy part of this by just asking what is the escape from this? What should the policymakers be doing to get away from just this endless inflationary cycle that we've essentially been in since 2008, 2009, with just these rising prices, continued economic stagnation? I mean, we're seeing something similar here. If we were actually had the ear of any of these policymakers, what would we be telling these people? What is the way out of this cycle, of this boom-bust cycle that we've just been going through again and again over the last 20 years?
Well, stop meddling with the money supply, right? I would argue that you could basically freeze the money supply, M1. Just let it sit where it is. Don't increase it too much when you think it's necessary. Then you don't have to reduce it when inflation is too high. So just don't meddle with the money stock. Of course, this, one has to admit, would go hand in hand with a massive adjustment crisis in the economy. Lots of businesses are not sustainable when monetary policy is sound. So they would have to go bankrupt. But I think that's hard in the short term, but it will be beneficial in the long term. To get back on a sustainable growth path, we would have to do that. And if we don't, we will have these frequent financial crises, quite regularly.
Yeah, and it's the reverse of what you know before, right? Asset prices going up all the time. Some people benefit from that. And if you have a retrenchment, all these zombie companies go bankrupt, and asset price actually deflates somewhat, yes, many people would suffer from that, but also first-time homebuyers would benefit.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, if you stop expanding the money stock, you would stop overproportionate asset price inflation. That's the most important part. You would make money an interesting asset to save. Traditionally, money has been the easiest way of saving, providing for the future. You just put some money on the side. It's very easy to do. Everybody can do it. You don't need special knowledge about financial markets and so on. So, your average family can do it. Assets like houses become a less attractive investment for people who want to increase their savings. So the demand would go down. People would buy houses to live in them, but not to park their savings and make a profit on them. So you would take out a lot of the social problems that we observe right now, especially for young families and low-income earners, if we were to stop expanding the money stock.
Of course, if we have any hope of getting such a policy reversal that requires changing the ideology of policymakers and of the general brain trust influencing those decisions, and we've seen internationally periods of inflation helping give rise to popularity within Austrian economics. The financial crisis did that in the United States with Ron Paul's campaign as well. We saw the hyperinflation in Brazil helping lead to the less Marx, more Mises protests. We've obviously seen triple-digit inflation help with the rise of Javier Milei. And so given that we have this, the public recognizing that the inflationary pressures are much greater than what the central banks are doing, how is the development of, are you seeing any increased interest in Austrian economics within Europe? And of course, you're the founder of Austrian Economics Meeting Europe, which brings younger Austrian scholars together to talk about such ideas and issues. But how do you feel the interest in Austrian economics is reacting to the pressures that you've identified?
Yeah, I think the interest is clearly growing. You've mentioned our conference series, the Austrian Economics Meeting Europe, which we started back in 2015. And we do it once a year in different European cities. We've been in Vienna. That was our first location, Vienna, Austria. Very fitting for an Austrian economics meeting. And then we went to Prague. We went to Budapest, Krakow, Madrid, Vilnius in Lithuania. And last year we've been in Angers. So we had a 2-year break because of COVID. And then we started in Vilnius in 2022 and 2023. We were in Angers. And the conference has been growing. And every year we get new submissions from people we haven't met before. We didn't know they existed and were interested in Austrian economics, researchers from different European universities. The fact that we travel around from country to country also makes it easier for people in different parts of Europe to join. When we are near, they can more easily join the conference, and it's been growing, and it has become very dynamic. One of the most striking examples in Europe is Poland. There are so many Austrian economists in Poland. I think more than in the U.S. by now. Yeah, it's quite astonishing how much of an interest is among young scholars in Poland, also in libertarian ideas in general. So, and this is true for other Eastern European countries as well, but Poland is really the most striking case. And this is like always, right? When problems increase, people look for answers, and they are open towards new ideas. And the Austrian view has always been a very interesting, I think, alternative perspective on things. And yeah, people are getting more interested in it.
I do know we have some European listeners out there because I've gotten some emails from them. How can they learn more about Austrian economics meeting Europe?
Well, they can always contact me. They can sign up on our newsletter on the website. It's aem-europe.com. And yeah, we have regular meetings, as I said. The call for papers is still open. Our next meeting is going to be in Leipzig, Germany. So we will be in Germany for the first time. I look forward to that. And we will be at the University of Leipzig on May 30, I think. We start on May 30. Checked on the website for the exact date. It's for 2 days. And yeah, you can still submit papers, and we look forward to receiving them.
And before we let you go, we are recording at AERC. This will be published afterwards. But can you talk about some of the research that you're doing right now? I know you're on a few sessions during the event.
Yeah, I'm involved in 4 sessions. That never happened to me before. I usually come here to have some fun, but this time I have to work. Luckily, I have co-authors, so 2 of the presentations will be done by my co-authors, and I will give 2 presentations. And one is today on, the title is A Critique of Inflation Measurement. So I will talk about some of the elements in a slightly more technical fashion that we discussed here in this podcast. And my other presentation is going to be in the South Royalton Conference panel, where we talk about the continued importance of the topics that were raised at the famous South Royalton Conference 50 years ago, the same year that Hayek won the Nobel Prize. And in that panel, I will talk about welfare economics and Wertfreiheit, value freedom, so arguing essentially that it is very difficult to do welfare economics without value judgments. And most Austrian economists always held on to the ideal of value-free social sciences, and there is, of course, something to it. It's very important to try to do it. But when it comes to welfare economics, it's essentially impossible. And I will criticize some of the views that Israel Kirsner has presented, and I will dive into some of the arguments that Mary Rothbard made. Rothbard is somewhat ambiguous on the topic. He also, especially in his early writings, tried to uphold value freedom, but I think increasingly he realized that this is going to be impossible. Hence his interest in libertarian philosophy and writing The Ethics of Liberty, because he saw that you need this ethical foundation. You cannot completely detach economics from ethics. So I take up some of these elements and, hope for an interesting discussion.
All right. Well, with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up this episode of Radio Rothbard. Thank you for listening. Thank you to our guest, Karl-Friedrich Israel. And we will be back next week with another episode, and we'll see you next time.